Okay, today I am pressing on into Tom Chetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and The Angel Out Ahead, which is proving difficult. And I'm about to have to try to summarize what Chetham and Corbin are saying. There are helpful summaries, I think, at the beginning of the last video. I'm in the second half of the fifth chapter called The Angel and Individuation. And we're essentially talking about the sort of overlap between Corbin's thought and Jung's thought. Um, Okay, so for me, this is all in the context of the sort of massive sociological changes that are going on in our time, that serve as a response in themselves and also provide a setting for a further response to the meaning crisis and the meta crisis. And that is basically the shift from sort of cities as the center of gravity of civilization to the local tribal scale. And that shift is going to be occurring over, quite a long time. The idea through Jordan Hall being that with the invention of the internet, we sort of lose the incentive for getting all of our creative minds in the same physical space in cities because we can do so online. And so people will naturally gravitate back towards local tribes, whether that be through dystopia or utopia. Okay, and then in the context of that, we also have Vervaeke's prescription for the cultural response. There are also sort of culturally derived creative responses to the meta crisis, which are not exactly assimilable into the context of responding to the meaning crisis, but can be found through the same setting of group practice to creative problem solving in groups, that kind of thing, collective intelligence. Okay, and then within the sphere of the cultural response to the meaning crisis, meta crisis, as I roughly just laid out, Vervaeke's framing of like what kinds of we have the ecology of practices in a community of practitioners with a viable worldview. This is a kind of wisdom school model. The idea being that we can run some kind of new cultural software to insulate us from the perils of the modern world. And then we have to decide, like, as soon as we have that, obviously everyone's going to say, oh, we should practice what I practice. These practices and these practices and these practices. It's like, well, how do we decide? And the idea is that obviously there's going to be a lot of bottom-up emergence, but we can also have some sort of top-down help from people who know a lot, that it can at least provide some guideposts. And Vervaeke sort of started that with his DIME model, dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices, three of which I consider to be roughly self-explanatory. It's also a pretty good summary of this in the 19th video in the psychological types series that goes into a bit more of why those four. But here in this series, the question has been why the imaginal? What's so important about imaginal practice? What help can it be to us? And that's taken us rather far afield into Jung and Corbin. And I'm going to need to try and bring, over a period of several years, I'm going to try and need to bring all of that down into actionable practice, I would say. And so the idea is that imaginal work can help us. And so one of the sort of guidepost questions is why and how can it help us? And I've provided an answer to that. So I understand that imaginal work has to do with aspects of our development, which include but are not limited to development of the soul, spiritual development, and moral development in particular. And so then I would say I was just talking about sort of insulation, cultural insulation, new cultural software, so as to sort of defend and protect us from crappy thinking, basically, and everything that's going on. So it's great once we gather in place. How do we like do the group thing in a way that works and can defend us against bullshit? the tides and tides of bullshit. And I think part of the answer is the work with the soul that as I've laid it out. And the way that I've laid that out is quite simple, is that um actually I won't go into that. I'm just gonna say, yeah, like essentially a big part of it is sort of practicing taking any duality, any polarity, any binary structure, and practicing being able to take up both sides of that structure. And so, we see these simplifying binary narratives, black and white thinking sort of all over the world, whether it be between men and women, left and right, etc. There are obviously more. Can we practice taking up the alternative point of view? And the idea would be that as we practice doing this, I think of that practice as the practice of liberating the soul. Why? Because as we're stepping out of those ideologies through the practice of perspective taking, we're sort of unveiling more of the self in a way. And so I understand that framing is all necessary to understand what it means to take up the perspective of the soul. So this is a kind of wisdom school model that is conceived as a kind of uh, yeah, a cultural practicum or pedagogy that can defend against ideology. And more than that, it can find ways to take any sort of binary conflict and hopefully turn that into something generative and positive. And I won't elaborate on that part of it anymore now. I'm going to leave that there and say that from that place, what we can understand is that this capacity to be able to take up the perspective of the soul is something that is available to us. And by the soul in this context, sort of all I really mean is all I really mean is that about us which is sort of least influenced by um yeah, ideology in a way. I do have to qualify that because I was talking about how I feel that dogma is in fact important and that taking on new dogma, such as is found in community and community practice, could be a really important component of actually liberating the soul, which seems counterintuitive. And so I have to emphasize this context of group practice and being able to step into and step out of different perspectives, but also to be able to do that in groups and to create within those groups. And I think of that, I think of the in a way the collective intelligence and the dogma that goes on in groups as necessary, sort of prerequisite for fully being able to step into the perspective of one's own soul. And one way to conceptualize that is in terms of anima and anima mundi, the idea that there are, hang on, I should even be even more careful there. I have to say that there are, I think, individual and collective aspects of the soul, and that the work of re-ensoulment of the world is sort of equally important and on a par with being able to take up the perspective of one's own soul. The idea being that the soul is not something that belongs to one, but is something that in a way, it's a mode of being. It's a place from out of which one can be present in the world. And there are aspects of that that are deeply objective and shareable, transmittable just as much as sort of personal and individual and unique. So that's one thing. That's soul conceived of in terms of individual and collective aspects that I feel is important. Then I have to make a couple of other points. One of them is there's something about the creative capacity of groups where all the people can generate and cultivate this capacity to step into the soul that I feel is I feel that that is a kind of important kind of work. Why do I feel that's important? Um, that's really through Jung and others. Something about I feel that the creative sort of problem solving and collective intelligence of those groups is going to be sort of most effective, most unfiltered, most uninhibited when we each have that capacity to be most ourselves. And the stuff about the soul is simply, in a way, one way of understanding that. But that's different. That work with individual and collective, that's a little bit different than anima and anima mundi. So the idea is that by doing work with the soul, both individually and in groups, that one can practice attending to the relationship between anima and anima mundi, soul and soul of the world. That framing helps us to avoid equating the collective dimensions of the soul with the soul of the world. I think those would be different. Another way of understanding that through McGilchrist would be that there's important kind of soul work that can occur in relation with oneself, in relation with other people, in relation with, let's say, the natural world, and in relation with the sacred. The idea that sort of concrete sensory things can be drawn up into ensoulment, and that sort of abstract bodies or forms, intelligibles, can be drawn down into soul. Okay, that's all still quite abstract. So pausing there, where does that leave us? Well, I think from there is sort of the biggest jump because that I think roughly makes sense. Like I think people could probably understand why all of that could be valuable in a world where we've really lost, you know, meaning, connection, belonging, and everyone's feeling lonely and atomized and like that. And we don't have any sort of easily accessible developmental models really that really help us. But then I think the main jump is toward the personification thing. And so if we understand taking up the soul in that way, basically the claim of Corbin particularly, and Jung by extension, is that it's reasonable to personify the soul. The claim is that there are certain affordances, certain sort of developmental opportunities become available if one chooses to practice, to live in such a way that the soul is actually a figure. And I think part of the difficulty here is that without practicing this stuff, it really becomes hard to understand what is meant. Because somehow I think the soul has this capacity that we can be in relation with the soul. For example, Jung, in his version of active imagination, had many dialogues with the soul in an imaginal way, in a living way, like had a conversation with a real figure that he called the anima or soul. And that may be valuable. It may also come with certain risks, but it may be necessary and important, and we can work out how to manage those risks. But the soul, we also have this capacity, as I said, to take up its perspective, which is different than being in dialogue with it. And somehow both of those are the case. It can be sort of externalized as a personified figure and related with, and it can also be taken on. We can also relate from out of that mode of being, from out of that mode of presence. And Corbin's understanding is that when we relate from the perspective of the soul, we're inhabiting the imaginal world or imaginal worlds. And so I think like one way to talk about that would be that this work of sort of disidentifying from different ideological stories is also that's also another way of talking about psycho-emotional work, I think. And that as we can sort of progressively disidentify from different m material, like psycho-emotional material, then that's another way of talking about Jungian individuation that has to do properly with the development of the soul conceived of in these terms. So that's how we can sort of talk about a general model of development from that place. And I think that's why and how it can make sense to understand that by practicing in that way, these claims like that we can sort of unlock deeper personhood, like be more of a person, be more of ourselves, so become more whole, deeper presence is available, sort of existential awareness, as well as wisdom would be the claim. And that all seems pretty reasonable to me. And this is sort of it's a little bit more of a, like I can understand that in terms of Jungian individuation in a way, although the stuff about groups is new. And definitely the Heideggerian stuff is not in Jung. I think there are several points from there as well. One of them is about these modes of being, which is, yeah, again, not at all in Jung. And so this is the idea that the soul in this process, as we've described it, can kind of be in different states, different modes of presence. And that, like, one way to conceptualize that is that, like, different levels of a video game. That the soul is like the main character in a RPG, and that by practicing taking up the perspective of the soul, will we enter a certain mode of being that have certain qualities of personhood and existence in different degrees, and a certain way that the world appears. And I think I partly understand that this is kind of what Corbin means by developing this capacity not only to take up the perspective of the soul, but also to inhabit different imaginal worlds. So to take on different quote unquote spiritual universes. What I take this to mean, roughly speaking, is that when we work with what I'm calling the soul here, is that the world can appear at different stages in a very different way. We can be present in a very different mode at different stages, which Corbin thinks of as sort of stations along the way with reference to his Persian Sufism. And there's obvious, um, that's kind of one way of talking about Jungian individuation again, or that's another language for it. But then we have some stuff that's not in Jung that we need to address, or that I need to address here, so as to be able to evaluate this stuff. Okay, and so what is that? Well, I think that this group context that I'm talking about, this kind of work, both with individual and collective, like that, this kind of cultural work that involves deeply, deep inner work in this way that it's also in groups. I think for me, part of the whole point of that is that we, yeah, can take any binary, any duality, and sort of notice when we're trapped within it as a structure deriving from the mind and be able to come out of it. And so for me, sort of any duality that can be defined is one of those, a kind of ideological story or a lens through which we see the world. And I think a huge part of the normative standard that I understand here, when we're really getting down, developing toward access to gnosis, access to revelation, access to transformative experience and the deep states of I understand that through Vervaeke, all of that is necessary in order to restore our access to meaning and connection and belonging and like that. And that without transformation, without gnosis, that we're not guaranteed those things. So that's in some way I feel why it matters. And so then I understand that from that point of view, where any duality is defined, if we side with one half, and again, we have to sort of agree that the duality is a reasonable one, like individual and collective, let's say, or men and women. Like I can't just say bookmarks and sunglasses and like, oh, we have to, it's like, no, it's not, those are just, that's not a duality. Like, and I'm not going to talk here about how to identify which ones matter or not, but let's assume for the sake of argument that we can do that. Well, I notice that, yeah, there are all these, because we're so individualized at the moment, there are all these temperamental biases that are coming into play. And so, for example, Corbin is deeply opposed to uh, what he feels is the dogma that goes along with this sort of fundamentalism of the exoteric aspects of the um, traditions that he investigates. And I think it's fair to see that if we regard those group settings, I don't know, as in some way fallen, like that there does tend to be this connection between fundamentalism and sort of collectivization toward unity, monotheism, and dogma all sort of going together. It is rational, I think, to want to leave the city for the sake of the desert and to emphasize the individual and gnosis. And I think it's reasonable to notice from there that there are equivalent risks to going into the desert. And that really what we're seeking, I think, is to create new, yeah, can we imagine a new relationship between individual and collective that could be mutually supportive of both? And obviously, I don't want to be too idealistic about it, but I think that that is the real problem that besets us. And so I'm coming to these writings from the context that we're going to need more than esotericism, and that it's simply not the case that we're sort of finally going to convince everyone that esotericism is the way. maybe after a long time. So that's the individual collective thing. So where do I need to press from there? I'm going to mention two other things. One of them is that there's this tension between depth and breadth. And depending how seriously we take the problem of the metacrisis, it may be the case that orienting toward a sort of catalytic community, as has been called for by Vervaeke and Jordan Hall and many others, the idea being that there's a sort of profound cultural shift that is in a way derived from, in a sense, derived from revelation, or that's just a shorthand for it. And that orienting toward the depth there of finding that thing which is new, or that way which is new, ought to take priority, and that being able to sort of share with everyone is of secondary importance. And there's a pretty strong case for that. Maybe it's for others to work out how to share. And so I think what I would say is that even if that would be the case, even if it's the catalytic community that we're seeking for, and we understand maybe that by finding the right sort of signal, that it's something that can sort of automatically be shared. It's like discovering language for the first time. Suddenly everyone can pick it up. I think we still have the problem that within that catalytic community, we need to work out this balance between the individual and the collective. And so that framing doesn't obviate the need for that balance. And so it really does rely on this sense of the importance of the group and the collective intelligence. And as Thich Nhat Hanh said, the next Buddha will be a Sangha, a community. And so I'm not really interested in, sort of going off into the desert for the sake of individual gnosis. I think there are aspects of that which are profoundly valuable and important and necessary. But there have been many sort of awakened beings as individuals, let's say, who sort of come and go, and we sort of still have the problems that we do. And there's a way that sort of the more awakened beings that we have, the better. But I think that shouldn't blind us to the importance for new ways of culture, new cultural ways. Okay, so that's one thing. And I think from that vantage point, it's reasonable to question a lot of what Corbin is talking about, and to like maybe it can be worked. We can work out how to integrate some of it. Um, but yeah, there are all these dangers of individualism, including self-deception, spiritual narcissism, spiritual bypassing, yeah, mutilation of the soul, the dogma of individuals, the local maximum of development that individuals can get into, like the profound absence of the group, is significant. Yeah, and sort of burying one's head in the sand in relation to the quote unquote real situation in the world. So this is kind of the lotus eating response to that. Oh, I'm just going to worry about my own development and not worry about the world, despite being incarnated within it and despite being dependent on it. The spiritual wisdom of the greatest masters, I mean, if I give Christ and the Buddha as two examples, are about being down and among the people and helping out, not about going up into the clouds. Okay, so then there's one other main point, maybe a couple. Let's see. So from there, I have to say that I think if we understand the relevance of sort of individual soul work and collective soul work in the way that I've described, that it can be reasonable to use this combination of Corbin and Jung to help orient us within that. and that there may be profound importance to personification and to deeper presence that we haven't noticed, that we've been cut off from, and that reintegrating imaginal work and the imagination in this way could be profoundly beneficial. I do think that's the case. And so the question would be that there's a lot of claims being made about what is quote unquote the right way to do that, or what is in fact the truth of that process. And I think it's sort of all very well to read about through Corbin. It's very sort of abstract. It's sort of like we're reading Chetham, and then he's referencing Corbin, and Corbin is referencing people like Surawadi and Avicenna who are writing in the 12th century. And it's just kind of what they said. And like maybe they had some truth, maybe even probably. But I think a healthy dose of skepticism is valuable here. Okay, and then Corbin is making several claims. One of them is that in order to, no, hang on, I have to do it more carefully. Corbin is firstly saying that when we learn how to take up the perspective of the soul in the way that's been described, which is work that includes, but is maybe not limited to Jung's active imagination, this relationship with the soul, that when we do that, another relationship opens up. And that is the relationship between the soul as we've been talking about it and the divine double. And that divine double is otherwise known as the Socratic daimonion, Vervaeke's sacred second self. It's Charles Stang, the divine double. And in Corbin, it's the term angel. And so there may be sort of one of these figures that has a sort of more privileged, in a way, relationship with quote unquote the soul. But this conception opens up a cosmology of you could say spiritual presences. The idea being that we have been sort of blind to that, and that this. I think I understand that that's sort of not exactly an introduction of a whole lot that's new. It's a way of sort of reconceiving of what's going on already, but in terms that are in a way more conscious and more personified. So the idea would be through Jung and this notion that the phenomena, the images, or the angels, or the archetypes all sort of correspond at this intermediate layer in some way. The idea would be through Jung, which is helping me here, that we are actually we are already influenced by these very powerful unconscious forces. And that it's reasonable to conceive of such forces as archetypes. We see again the importance of the collectivity, where the unconscious in Jung fades into the collective unconscious. The archetypes have collective aspects. It may be only from out of groups that archetypes in their fullness can be related with. That's an aside. So this is basically the point of, I think basically once we understand the value of both relating with the soul and taking up the perspective of the soul and conceiving of development in those terms, which is sort of a combination of Corbin and Jung, then this work of re-ensoulment opens up, and it opens up both in relation to things, to objects, to matter, in relation to the Heideggerian stuff about the image, the phenomena, the way that things shine forth in their appearing. But also through the ecology of practices, particularly in relation to ritual, we can understand the value, I think, of I mean, and the psychology can help us there, the value of relating with, I would say, these imaginal presences. And, but you have to be so careful of then not to regress to animism. Like, it's so important to me that this can be rational. But what I'm understanding, I think, is that this language of the imaginal, this language of angels, can be taken on as simply a way to conceive, a way to reconceive of what's already going on. So it's a way of personifying everything. Yep. And so hopefully then the sort of concomitant risks of anthropomorphism and Jungian projection would be accounted for by the other strands of practice that are going on here, like in the midst of the ecology of practices involving all of this work. Hopefully a lot of that is accounted for, by which I mean that we're sort of gaining the capacity to our vision is becoming more clear. We're less sort of influenced by that which is unconsciously pushing us around, which could be conceived of in terms of purity. Okay, then there's again another couple of points from there. Okay, so first would be that one may be reasonably, I think, attuned to all the risks that go along with that uh, personification and so on. And I think those are risks that are worth encountering. And the idea being that recovering this work with the imaginal and re-ensoulment is maybe really necessary and really needed for us to, in a way, reverse engineer ourselves away from nihilism towards meaning, towards significance and coherence in our lives. I think personification goes along with that, as well as with presence. And it's reasonable to conceive of this in terms of dialogical work and parts work, all of which is having a bit of a moment that we're hoping is not simply transient. And so even if we encounter risks and problems, I think they may be worthwhile to take up and to take on. I would throw in a further idea that it may only be from out of the perspective of some of these figures that the quote unquote revelation that we are seeking or looking for can transpire. And that the capacity to take up the perspective of these presences may be sort of necessary prerequisite for transformation of the, in a way, religious kind. So what I'm pointing to there is that the importance of this stuff about personification and perspective taking may be that there are certain affordances, spiritual and otherwise, that are opened from that kind of place that are not available elsewhere, and that we may desperately need those affordances. That may be the sort of source of unity And I might refer people to the episodes in Jung on Christianity, which are about Christ as archetype, and various others that talk about the Gnostic Acts of Peter. There's 4 episodes in that series, in that sort of sub-series that talk about the power of the revelation and the idea of the Christ event as a kind of ingression from a higher dimension, the equivalent of which could be helpful, to say the least. You want to be careful about sort of aiming for that, though. There's a lot else that's valuable here before that point, or instead of that point. Okay, there's then another couple of other things. It may be reasonable to understand the sort of development of the soul in these terms as a sort of succession of relationships between different, let's say, I don't know, you could say spiritual forces, but gosh, it's already pretty far out. It may be reasonable, but it may also be radically self-deceptive. And we would want to account for that with the rest of I would say, with collective intelligence and the rest of the ecology of practices. And this work is really only available, only accessible to those doing the rest of that work because the risk of self-deception would be too great. And that constitutes a significant pushback to Corbin. Other points would be that Chetham and Corbin are claiming that it's necessary to sort of go back and readopt these medieval cosmologies in order to do this. And firstly, I don't know that we're rationally able to do that. And secondly, I would question its value. But I think we also want to be open-minded about sort of why he thinks that's important. And Corbin, I think, made this sort of key claim that there are certain, again, you could say affordances that are opened up by being able to restore ourselves into the cosmology of Persian Sufism that are not available with any other cosmology. Okay, and if that's the case, we would want to be able to assess and verify his claims in practical terms. And I'm open to that. Okay, then another way to understand Corbin is again in terms of this we talked about this like sort of intermediary realm of spiritual presences, which in this Persian Persian Sufist cosmology are understood as sort of emanations, I guess, of a divine intelligence. Um, I'm just really conscious of the risks of reifying this dualism between good and evil that we already see is running rampant through Christianity. But Corbin understands that there is a certain quote unquote angel or divine being that has, in a way, a privileged relationship with the soul. And that another way of talking about that being the divine double, sorry, the divine double and then the soul. And another way of talking about those is sort of in terms of the higher and lower aspects of the soul. But he also talks about them, I understand, in terms of the active and passive uh, facets of the imagination per se. And it seems to be that it's something like that the faculty of imagination and the capacity to perceive and engage in the relationships that we've been describing go together, that they're roughly the same thing. And that's maybe what he means by the imaginal and imaginal work. And so I understand that what Corbin means here is that by cultivating and developing this relationship between what I've been calling the soul, which we can understand now as sort of the earthly or lower aspect of the soul, by cultivating the relationship between that and the divine double or angel, which we can understand as the higher or celestial or in some way more eternal part of the soul, that work can come to constitute the amnesis, the coming into presence or awareness of a being. That those two are actually aspects of a being. And I'm open to that too. Although again, we would want to somehow like it's fine to sort of just say that that's the case, but how do we know that that's the case? And I think that allows the sort of Heideggerian stuff goes along with that. So this kind of active presence is the coming into awareness of this being in some way. And that these moments of epiphany that have been discussed all along the way, an insight that constitute the sort of this deeper awareness of that which is beyond subject object or knower and known, these different dualities. Okay, so that's all sort of fine. That's all okay. I guess there again, that's where the sort of further claims come in about like when that goes on, when that takes place, that's when we get sort of deeper, again, existential awareness, deeper existence, deeper personification, it's sort of a restoration of aliveness and the truth of who we are, our wholeness, which ties into the Jungian stuff, but with sort of more. It's going along with the sort of intensification of being and a restoration of sort of, yeah, meaning, including purpose, coherence, significance, and mattering. All right. From there, then I'm going to go on into Corbin. And so where Corbin is going to go is that he is sort of rejecting the collectivism and the dogma and talking about the development of the individual in the individual's terms. And he sort of, yeah, Corbin ends up talking about um, needing to distinguish the imagination from the imaginary. And so I've already talked about that, I would say, in terms of the prescription as it's been laid out so far, in terms of the collective intelligence of groups, in terms of the ecology of practices, that can help with this stuff. Although groups can also definitely go into the imagination. That would be called a cult. And so, yeah, I have to try and get through the rest of the text and derive what value from it I can. And so Corbin wants to talk about the importance of because he's sort of rejecting the collectivism and the dogma and the exoteric, he's sort of orienting toward the individual and in a way the internal imaginal path. And he understands that there's a sort of quote unquote personal guide um, that is internal that appears. And I've understood that this guide is sort of different than the divine double that we were talking about and different from the soul that we were talking about. But that this guide sort of is a kind of personal messenger who appears and guides the visionary theosopher on their way of um, purifying their imagination so that they can better distinguish between the imagination and the imaginary, sorry, the imaginal and the imaginary. And while I wouldn't want to deny that that might be possible, it also seems to me to come with many risks and be very elitist or very much for the few. And so I'm questioning the relevance of it and also the soundness. But at least I can still try to be open to what he's talking about and continue into the rest of the chapter, which is in chapter 5, the angel and individuation, and try to get through the rest of the text, which has been, amazingly helpful so far. See what else we can find. So this is what I would consider to be a reasonable summary of all of the work so far. All right, and I'll continue with this just afterwards.